Section 1. The Art of Hiding Things in Plain Sight. There is something deeply satisfying about the moment you notice something that was always there but somehow invisible. That feeling, that tiny electric pop behind your eyes when the hidden thing finally reveals itself, is one of the most quietly pleasurable experiences a person can have while watching television. And Family Guy, whatever you think of its modern seasons, has been engineering those moments for over 25 years. The writers and animators who built this show were obsessed with hiding things. Not just jokes, not just references, but entire layers of meaning, coded messages, recurring details, and self-aware winks that were planted specifically for the kind of person who watches slowly, who pauses, who rewinds, who notices. This is a show that was built from the very beginning with two separate audiences in mind. There is the audience that watches casually, laughing at the loud jokes and the obvious gags and the cutaways that flash by in seconds. And then there is the other audience, the one that leans a little closer to the screen, the one that reads the newspapers in the background, the one that catches the face of a character from a different show standing silently in a crowd scene, the one that notices when the sheet music on a piano is not just decorative scribbling but is actually the correct notation for the song being played. Family Guy has always rewarded that second kind of attention. And tonight, in whatever quiet corner of the world you are in right now, we are going to move through those rewards together. The concept of the Easter egg in film and television traces back to the late 1970s, when a programmer named Warren Robinett hid his name inside the Atari 2600 game Adventure, a secret message buried so deep in the code that most players would never find it. He did it because Atari refused to credit their developers. And so Robinett turned his own act of defiance into a tiny hidden room that read, "Created by Warren Robinett." The egg was found, the term stuck, and from that point forward, hiding things inside creative work became a beloved tradition. In animation, where every single frame is drawn deliberately and every background detail is a conscious choice, Easter eggs became something even richer. Every object on a shelf is there because someone put it there. Every headline on a newspaper someone wrote out. Every sign on a storefront, every license plate, every framed photograph in the background of a scene, all of it is intentional, which means all of it is potentially significant. Family Guy understood this intuitively. Seth MacFarlane and the original writing team that built the show in the late 1990s came from a culture of animation geeks, film nerds, and television obsessives. These were people who had grown up rewinding VHS tapes to catch moments that blinked past, who spent hours picking apart the episodes of other shows they loved and admired. When they built Family Guy, they built it the way a great magic trick is built, with the understanding that the secret work happening beneath the surface is just as important as the spectacle on top. The show that looked like pure chaos was, at its heart, meticulously constructed, and the evidence for that is everywhere, hiding in places that most people never think to look. What makes Family Guy's Easter eggs particularly interesting is how varied they are. Some of them are obvious jokes that you either catch or you miss, quick visual gags designed for the pause button generation. Others are genuinely subtle, the kind of detail that requires either an encyclopedic knowledge of the show or a complete accident of attention to discover. Some are warm and affectionate, little gifts for loyal viewers who have been watching since the beginning. Some are wickedly self-aware, the show commenting on itself, on the audience, on the act of watching in real time. And some of them are so deeply layered that discovering them requires cross-referencing multiple episodes across seasons that aired years apart. The show premiered on the 31st of January 1999, right after the Super Bowl, which meant that its very first episode was seen by around 22 million people who had never heard of it before. And yet, even in that premiere, even in the very first episode ever aired, there were already things hiding. Background details in the Griffin house, visual gags that flickered by in less than a second, the beginning of a habit that would define the entire run of the show. Over the course of the next several hours, we are going to move through those hidden layers together. We are going to walk through the pilot and the early seasons, through the rooms of the Griffin house and what they reveal about the world the show built, through the hidden backstories woven into the characters, through the secret messages embedded in newspapers and signs and license plates and background crowds. We are going to look at what the cutaway gags were hiding inside themselves, the self-referential jokes that fold inward like mirrors facing mirrors, the hidden timeline of Stewie Griffin's strange and evolving existence, and finally the rarest, most obscure Easter eggs that dedicated fans spent years tracking down. So settle in, get comfortable, let the lights be low and the room be quiet. Because we are about to look at a show you thought you knew and find that there was always more to it than met the eye. And before we move forward, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now and what time it is. Also, if you are enjoying what you are hearing, a subscription means the world, and it takes about 2 seconds. Now, let us begin. Section 2. The pilot and the secrets that started everything. The very first episode of Family Guy is called Death Has a Shadow, and it aired on the 31st of January 1999. But before we even get to what is hidden inside that episode, the episode itself has a history that most people do not know, a hidden layer that exists before the first frame you ever saw on television. What most viewers have seen is the polished broadcast version. What almost no one saw at the time was the original 15-minute pitch pilot that Seth MacFarlane made to sell the show to Fox. This pilot was for years considered lost media. Only a fragment of it had ever surfaced as a bonus feature on an early DVD set, and that fragment covered only the first 7 minutes. The rest was gone, or so everyone thought. Then, on the 20th of March 2025, the complete original pitch pilot was discovered on the website of an animator named Robert Paulson and was re-uploaded for fans to see. And when they did, they found that the version of Family Guy that almost existed was a genuinely different thing. In the pitch pilot, Chris Griffin is voiced not by Seth Green, but by Seth MacFarlane himself. Meg is voiced by Rachel MacFarlane, Seth's sister, rather than by Lacey Chabert, who would voice the character in the broadcast first season. Mr. Weed, Peter's boss at the toy factory, is voiced by Butch Hartman, the same Butch Hartman who would go on to create The Fairly OddParents and Danny Phantom. The Cleveland who appears briefly in the pilot is a prototype version, with a different hairline, a different mustache, and a different voice entirely. He is voiced by Phil Lamar rather than by Mike Henry. In fact, this proto-Cleveland appears in one scene, and then the actual Cleveland appears in a later scene, as though the show had not yet fully decided which version of the character it wanted. There is something quietly extraordinary about comparing the pitch pilot to the broadcast episode. Stewie in the very earliest version has none of the ambiguity that would come to define him in later seasons. He is simply the evil one. There is no softer side being hinted at, no warmth being held in reserve. He hates his family with a focused, committed purity that the later seasons would slowly erode. And Brian in those earliest frames is limited almost entirely to his core joke that in a household full of people who cannot think clearly, the dog is the sharpest mind in the room. The more complex Brian, the one with the failed novel and the unrequited feelings and the philosophical crises, has not arrived yet. What you are watching is the skeleton, the embryo of something that would eventually become very large. The broadcast version of Death Has a Shadow is dense with things worth noticing. The episode's premise involves Peter losing his job at the happy-go-lucky toy factory after drinking too much at a stag party and falling asleep at work, which causes defective and dangerous toys to make it through production and into children's hands. Among the dangerous products shipped out is a bottle of pills inside a Pound Poochie box, a hatchet labeled as a silly ball, and other genuinely unsafe items. These products are shown being opened by children with a casual grimness that sets the tone for the show's entire approach to dark comedy. The joke is not that something terrible happened, but that it was inevitable given the specific incompetence involved. What is hidden in this episode, though, is layered throughout its backgrounds and its quick cuts. Watch the stag party scene carefully, and you will see the walls decorated in a way that is slightly inconsistent with the exterior we will later see of the Drunken Clam. The bar that Peter and his friends are supposed to frequent has not yet been given its definitive visual identity. The early Griffin house, too, has subtle differences from what it would become. The kitchen in the pilot has different details on the counter, different items on the shelves, a slightly different arrangement of furniture that will shift and settle over the course of the first season. There is a gag involving Peter dumping welfare money from a blimp over a football stadium. When the crowd begins scrambling for falling bills, one of the people in the crowd is meant to evoke Tom Hanks. Peter recognizes him from the film Big. The joke is quick, the connection is quick, but the show is already doing something it would do for decades, hiding a reference inside a reference so that the outer joke works on its own, but a deeper layer of it rewards the person who is paying very close attention. The first episode also features a sequence that would later become one of the most analyzed and discussed moments in the show's history, the animation of characters waiting during a cutaway. In the broadcast version, the cutaways happen seamlessly, the show cutting to its comic digressions and then cutting back. But in the Back to the Pilot episode that aired in Season 10, when Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the events of this first episode, they observe something that the original audience never got to see. The Griffin family standing completely motionless in the kitchen while the cutaway plays out around them, just waiting, frozen in place with nothing to do. It is the show's retroactive confession about what cutaways actually are: interruptions that remove the characters from the story until the story is ready to resume. The fact that this observation was hidden inside a callback to the first episode gives it an additional layer of meaning that no viewer in 1999 could have anticipated. One of the most technical Easter eggs in the pilot involves the aspect ratio. The original broadcast version of the first 3 seasons of Family Guy was produced in the 4:3 ratio, the older squarish frame that dominated television before the widescreen 16:9 format became standard. When the show returned from its cancellation in 2005 for Season 4, it made the transition to widescreen. The Back to the Pilot episode uses this technical fact as a storytelling device. The sequences set in 1999 are shown in 4:3, the older squarish ratio, and the sequences in the present are in 16:9. The show is using the actual history of television broadcast formats as a way to signal which timeline the audience is in. It is the kind of detail that most viewers absorb without consciously registering it, which is exactly how the best Easter eggs work. The pilot also establishes something about the show's approach to music that would continue throughout the entire run. The episode uses a parody of the Seinfeld theme when Peter hires Jerry Seinfeld as a jester with his welfare money. The joke is obvious. What is not obvious is that the show's primary composers, Ron Jones in the early seasons and Walter Murphy across much of the run, were already doing something sophisticated, arranging original music that could mimic the style and feel of other composers' work accurately enough to function as genuine musical parody rather than mere imitation. This would later become explicit in the Brian Does Hollywood episode, where the nominees for Best Original Score at an Adult Film Awards show include the names of the show's actual composers alongside John Williams, the man who scored Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Schindler's List, as though it is the most natural thing in the world to list all of them in the same category. The show's opening credits sequence began to solidify over the course of that first season, and even in those credits, there were things hiding. The shot of Lois sitting at the piano while the family gathers around her for the theme song. That shot contains something that became one of the most referenced Easter eggs in the show's long history. The sheet music visible on the piano above Lois's hands is not decorative. Someone in the animation department drew actual musical notation on that sheet music, and the notation they drew is the real score for the Family Guy theme song. It is not approximate, it is not a rough suggestion of notes. It is the correct sheet music for the melody that Peter and Lois are singing in that very moment. Every time that opening sequence played, every single episode for over 2 decades, that detail was there, accurate, precise, waiting for the person who knew how to read music to glance at the background of the opening credits and realize what they were looking at. That is the kind of thing that should not exist. It serves no dramatic purpose. It does not advance any story. It would have been perfectly acceptable, it would have been completely unnoticeable if the animators had simply drawn some squiggly lines that suggested sheet music without being actual sheet music. But they did not do that. They took the time to do it correctly, knowing that in all likelihood, the overwhelming majority of people who would ever watch the show would never see it, and the few who did would have to look very carefully. They did it anyway. That choice, that commitment to a detail that no one asked for, tells you something about the DNA of the show in its earliest days. There was a culture in that writer's room, in that animation pipeline, of hiding things and doing them right. The opening theme song itself has a hidden origin story that most viewers have never traced. Seth MacFarlane has spoken in interviews about his admiration for Norman Lear, one of the most influential television producers in American history, whose shows in the 1970s, including All in the Family, The Jeffersons, and Maude, defined a particular era of American comedy. Lear's shows often opened with the central characters singing at a piano or in some kind of informal domestic musical setting. The Family Guy theme, with Peter and Lois at the piano singing about their life together, is a direct homage to the opening of All in the Family, where Archie Bunker and his wife Edith sat at a piano and warbled "Those Were the Days." McFarlane took that specific visual and emotional language the family gathered around a domestic musical instrument, singing about who they are, and built it into the DNA of his show. Every episode of Family Guy begins with a tribute to a piece of television history that most of its audience has never seen. The Easter egg hidden in the opening sequence is not in any single frame. It is in the entire structure of the sequence itself, which is a love letter to a show from before most of Family Guy's audience was born. The first season also established several running gags whose origins are so early that most people who repeat them have forgotten how they started. Peter's physical conflicts with a giant chicken named Ernie, for example, began in the Season 2 episode Da Boom with a dispute over a restaurant coupon. The coupon is a specific detail. Ernie the giant chicken had given Peter a coupon that turned out to be expired, and Peter's outrage at this minor slight escalated into the first of the show's extraordinary battle sequences. The coupon is never mentioned again in subsequent chicken fight episodes. The battles become their own justification. But the origin, a coupon dispute between a man and an enormous bird, is the kind of specific, absurdist detail that the show planted in Season 2 and then let generate consequences across decades of subsequent storytelling. The chicken fights are among the most celebrated recurring gags in the show's history, and their hidden origin is a disagreement over a piece of promotional paper that Ernie may or may not have been responsible for misrepresenting. Section 3. The Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street, a building full of secrets. The Griffin family lives at 31 Spooner Street in a fictional Rhode Island town. The house itself, viewed from the outside, is immediately recognizable: yellow clapboard siding, white trim, a tealish roof, a bold red front door, a front yard with a single tree and a mailbox and a path. It is a picture of suburban American ordinariness. But step inside that house across the 25-plus years of its fictional existence, and you will discover that it is one of the strangest buildings in animated history. Because the Griffin House does not obey the laws of architecture, its rooms shift, its bathrooms migrate, its staircases connect to floors that should not exist. And hidden within all of that beautiful impossibility are dozens of details that reward the careful observer. The living room is the most consistently depicted space in the house. The green couch facing the television, the armchairs flanking it, the walls hung with family photographs and a particular painting that has been referenced in multiple episodes. The coffee table, perpetually present and occasionally significant. This room is the gravitational center of the show. More scenes happen here than anywhere else in the building, which means it has been drawn thousands of times across hundreds of episodes, and it has been drawn with a consistency that reveals just how carefully the visual world of the show was maintained through its early seasons. But here is where things get interesting. The painting on the living room wall, the one that hangs above the couch, the one that has been visible in the background of countless scenes, has been analyzed, discussed, and occasionally changed across the run of the show. It is not always the same painting. In some episodes, it is a still life. In others, it shifts to a landscape or a portrait. These are not animation errors, or at least not entirely. The show exists in a kind of fluid reality where the backgrounds are as subject to the needs of comedy as the characters are, and the painting on the living room wall is one of the most visible examples of that fluidity. Once you know to look for it, you cannot stop noticing it. The fireplace is perhaps the most ghostly detail in the Griffin House. In Season 3, during the holiday episode known as A Very Special Family Guy Freakin' Christmas, the Griffin living room contains a working fireplace. An ember escapes and catches the house on fire. The interior is substantially destroyed in the ensuing chaos. Brian suffers minor burns. It is a significant event within the story of that episode. And then, in the episodes that follow, the house is fine. The fireplace is gone. No explanation is offered. The next time you see the living room, it is as though the fire never happened, and the fireplace that caused the fire has vanished along with all memory of it. The show decided, somewhere between the writing of that episode and the production of the next season, that a fireplace in the living room was not a permanent feature, so it simply stopped being there. For viewers who had watched the Christmas episode and then caught the living room in the next episode, this quiet erasure was one of the earliest examples of a pattern that would define the show. The willingness to let dramatic events vanish without explanation, reset as though they never occurred. The kitchen is drawn with yellow walls and, in one of the show's most quietly strange design choices, a blue carpet on the floor. A kitchen with carpeted flooring is genuinely unusual, and it has been the subject of fan discussion for as long as the show has been airing. The choice seems to be a deliberate evocation of a particular era of American suburban interior design, the 1970s, when homes regularly made choices that later generations would find baffling. The blue kitchen carpet is not an accident. It is not an oversight. It is the animators committing to a specific vision of where and when this family exists aesthetically, even if they exist in an animated present that never ages or moves forward. Peter's famous recliner, positioned with a clear view of the television, has its own secret history. In the early seasons, the chair has a particular appearance, a worn, slightly deflated look that communicates years of use. As the show progressed and the animation style changed, the chair changed too. It became cleaner, smoother, more uniform. What had once looked like a specific, individual object that had been sat in thousands of times became a generic animated prop. This is one of the subtler animation transitions in the show, one that most viewers absorb unconsciously, but that becomes striking once you place an early season frame next to a late season frame side by side. Upstairs, the master bedroom belonging to Peter and Lois contains what has become known among devoted fans as the traveling bathroom. The ensuite bathroom attached to the master bedroom changes position between episodes. Sometimes it appears to be on the right side of the bed, sometimes on the left. The bedroom itself changes dimensions. In one episode, the room expands to accommodate a Quonset hut that Peter constructs as a personal retreat space, a prefabricated half-cylinder structure normally associated with military bases. The hut appears in several episodes as a fixture of the bedroom and then ceases to exist in others. The room also contracts back to its standard size between appearances of the hut. The Griffin master bedroom is, essentially, a space that rearranges itself according to whatever the scene requires, and the bathroom is the most traceable evidence of this ongoing architectural instability. Stewie's nursery is perhaps the most consistently depicted room in the entire house, and it is also the one that contains the most hidden depth. The nursery appears to be a standard baby's room, the crib, the mobile, the soft colors. But look beneath the surface, or rather, look at the surface very carefully, and the nursery reveals itself as a working laboratory. Under the floorboards, behind panels in the walls, concealed within what appear to be ordinary pieces of nursery furniture, Stewie has hidden weapons, devices, machines, and the materials needed to build more of all of them. In the early seasons, this dual nature of the nursery was one of the show's most reliable visual jokes. A shot would begin as a perfectly innocent view of a baby's room, and then pan slightly or reveal a detail that showed the weapons array hidden just below the innocent surface. The basement of the Griffin house is another zone of inconsistency that rewards careful attention. The basement exists as a permanent fixture in some stretches of the show's history and is rarely referenced in others. It has served as the location for Peter's home bar, for various schemes and projects, and for the occasional dramatic confrontation. But the basement's physical appearance shifts between appearances in ways that suggest it is being designed fresh for each episode rather than maintained as a consistent location. The staircase leading down to it changes direction. The walls change color. The layout changes. It is one of the most reliably inconsistent spaces in the house. Then there is the room that has become something of a legend among people who dissect the show in detail, the room with the piano. The Griffin household contains a piano room, a dedicated space where Lois keeps her piano and where the family has gathered for musical moments throughout the series. But the placement of this room within the house is genuinely difficult to reconcile with the rest of the floor plan. Based on the exterior shots of the house and the interior shots of the first floor, the piano room should not fit where it is sometimes depicted as being. Fans who have attempted to draw consistent floor plans of the Griffin house have found that the piano room is one of the elements that most reliably breaks any attempt at a rational architectural layout. This is where something interesting happens when you step back and look at all of these inconsistencies together. They are not random. They are not simply the result of careless animation. They form a pattern of a house that exists to serve the story rather than to exist as a real place. The Griffin house is, in a very real sense, alive. It grows rooms when rooms are needed and loses them when they are not. Its bathroom moves to accommodate the angle that a scene requires. Its kitchen has carpet because the joke needs the kitchen to feel a particular way. The house is not being maintained as a consistent geographic space, but as a collection of emotional and comedic spaces, each one existing fully when the story needs it and fading when the story moves on. Once you understand this, the inconsistencies stop being errors and start being features. The Griffin House is the most honest possible depiction of how memory and imagination actually work: fluid, shifting, organized around feeling rather than fact. And hidden within that shifting architecture, small permanent details accumulate. The family photographs on the walls change over seasons, sometimes showing events that have happened within the show's own history, sometimes showing images that seem to reference moments that were never explicitly depicted. The refrigerator in the kitchen has had drawings on it, childlike artwork that changes between episodes, occasionally depicting things that have no connection to the Griffin children's ages or apparent artistic abilities. The bookshelves that appear in various rooms contain book spines that are worth pausing on. Some of them are real books, some are parody titles, and some are references to things that only make sense if you know who wrote the episode you are currently watching. There is one more detail about the Griffin House that deserves particular attention, and it involves the address itself. The house is at 31 Spooner Street. The number 31 appears repeatedly throughout the show in contexts that are not directly related to the address. It shows up in scene numbers, in crowd sizes, in dates, in price tags visible in the backgrounds of stores the Griffins visit. Whether this is intentional or whether it is a case of the writer's subconscious fixating on a number they had planted in the show's own mythology is genuinely unclear. But once you start looking for 31 in the backgrounds of Family Guy episodes, you find it with a frequency that feels like it must mean something, even if no one has been able to definitively establish what that something is. The neighborhood around the Griffin House has its own quiet geography that accumulates across the seasons. The Swanson House across the street, the Quagmire House next door, the Brown House down the block, before Cleveland eventually moved away to Virginia for his own spin-off show. These houses have exterior appearances that are consistent within any given episode but subtly shift between episodes. The Swanson House, for instance, has a driveway that changes orientation between seasons, and the relationship of its front door to the street changes as well. Joe's special access modifications to the building, the ramps, and wider doorways that a wheelchair user would need, are visible in some exterior shots and absent in others. This inconsistency is interesting because it is specific to Joe's disability. The show is sometimes careful enough to show the building modifications that Joe's situation would require, and sometimes not careful enough. The presence of those modifications in some shots and their absence in others tells you which episodes were written with Joe's full humanity in mind. The Griffin House's backyard is one of the most inconsistently depicted spaces in the show's geography. The yard has a patio. The yard has a fence. The yard has grass that is sometimes well-maintained and sometimes not. The yard has, in various episodes, been the site of a swimming pool, a garden, a structure Peter built, and a space where various animals have appeared and then never appeared again. Most of these elements are episode-specific. They appear for the needs of a single story and then are gone. But one element of the backyard persists more consistently than the others, and that is the specific type of fence that borders the property. The fence style, its height, its material, the specific way its posts are arranged, has been consistent across a large number of episodes, across multiple seasons, drawn by different animation studios. Someone, at some point early in the show's history, made a decision about what the Griffin backyard fence looks like, and that decision stuck more durably than almost any other design choice in the building's history. The fence is the most stable architectural element in the most architecturally unstable building on television. That stability, surrounded by all of the shift and inconsistency that characterizes the rest of the space, makes the fence feel like a quiet anchor, the one fixed point in a building that otherwise exists according to the laws of emotion rather than physics. Section 4. Character continuity secrets and hidden backstories. Family Guy is often characterized as a show that does not care about continuity, a show where events reset between episodes, where characters learn lessons and then forget them, where major plot developments evaporate between seasons. And there is truth in that characterization, particularly of the show's middle and later seasons. But the early seasons, and the most carefully constructed episodes throughout the run, contain something that operates against this reputation. There are continuity threads that run through the show's history, threads that are never announced, never made explicit, never pointed to with a neon sign, but that reward viewers who are paying close enough attention to catch them. The most fundamental of these hidden continuity threads involves Stewie Griffin and the question of who can hear him. This sounds simple, but it is actually one of the most layered and deliberately engineered mysteries in the show's history. In the early seasons, the premise was clear and strange and funny. Stewie speaks in full sentences with a refined British accent and the vocabulary of a Victorian-era villain, but the adults around him either cannot hear him or process what he says as baby babbling. Only Brian the dog can understand and respond to Stewie directly, and this selective comprehension is one of the foundations of their friendship and one of the show's most durable sources of comedy. But as the show went on, the rules about who could hear Stewie began to drift. Some episodes featured adult characters seeming to understand him perfectly. Others played the old joke completely straight. The official wiki for the show contains an entire page dedicated to tracking which episodes include which characters understanding Stewie, because the inconsistency became notable enough to require documentation. This is not simply sloppy writing. Some of the most interesting moments in the show's later seasons come from exploiting the ambiguity, deliberately keeping the audience unsure whether a character who seems to respond to Stewie is actually responding to him or is simply reacting to something else in a way that happens to align with what Stewie said. The episode that brought this ambiguity most directly to the surface is Stewie's First Word, which explores the mechanics of Stewie's comprehension from a new angle. In this episode, Stewie, frustrated by poor internet connection and the restrictions of Lent, lets out a word in church that everyone in the building hears and understands perfectly. The episode then traces where Stewie learned this word, eventually landing on Lois as the source. By the end of the episode, Stewie has worked out something that the show had been dancing around for years, that people can understand him when he genuinely wants them to. The comprehension is not random. It is selective in a way that Stewie himself controls, whether consciously or not. This revelation is an Easter egg that takes over 15 seasons to fully decode. Every moment in those 15 seasons where Stewie seemed to be understood when he should not have been, or seemed to not be understood when understanding would have been natural, was quietly building toward a resolution that the show eventually provided. The breadcrumbs were there the whole time. The explanation was always latent in the rules the show had established. It simply took an enormous amount of time for the surface of the story to catch up with what the writers had apparently been thinking about for years. Brian Griffin's hidden backstory is another rich source of continuity Easter eggs. Brian is a dog who lives with the Griffin family, drinks martinis, drives a car, and talks. The show has always existed in comfortable ambiguity about what exactly Brian is, whether he is a human who happens to be a dog, or a dog who has achieved human-level cognition, or something else entirely that the show prefers not to define too precisely. But scattered across the seasons are small details about Brian's life before the Griffins that form, when assembled, a genuinely affecting portrait of a character with a past. Brian grew up in Texas. His mother was an actual dog, not a talking dog, not an anthropomorphic dog, but a regular dog who walked on 4 legs and had no capacity for human speech or thought. Brian's mother was put down when Brian was still a puppy, and her remains were turned into a table. This detail, which is one of the darkest pieces of backstory in the show's history, is planted early and referred to occasionally throughout the run. The table made from Brian's mother appears in at least one episode as a physical prop, placed in a scene without fanfare, present for viewers who are paying close enough attention to recognize what they are looking at. Brian's relationship with his son Dylan is another continuity thread that runs through the show in fragments. Dylan is Brian's biological son from a previous relationship, a relationship that Brian essentially abandoned, and whose consequences the show occasionally forces Brian to confront. The existence of Dylan is established, forgotten, re-established, and forgotten again across the seasons in a way that exactly mirrors the character's own relationship with his responsibilities. Brian's failing as a father is not just stated, it is demonstrated by the way the show treats his son as a fact that the narrative keeps losing interest in. The Easter egg here is structural. The show's own inconsistency about Dylan is the joke about Brian's inconsistency as a parent. Lois Griffin's hidden backstory is among the richest in the show. In the early seasons, Lois is established as a member of the Pewter-Schmidt family, one of the wealthiest families in New England. Her father, Carter Pewter-Schmidt, appears multiple times as a character, and their relationship is complicated in ways that take years to fully develop. But hidden within various episodes across the show's history are details about Lois's youth that paint a picture of a young woman who made choices that her wealthy family never fully recovered from. Her marriage to Peter, which the Pewter-Schmidt family has always treated with barely concealed horror, is repeatedly framed as a rebellion, a choice made specifically because it was the wrong choice by her family's standards. In the episode Peter's Got Woods from Season 4, and in various other episodes, Lois mentions a period of her life that she is evasive about references to things she did in college, or before college, or in the years between leaving her family's world and entering the Griffin family's world. The episode Peter's Two Dads plants a seed about the complexity of Lois's relationship with her Unger, Babs, that is then picked up again in much later seasons. And in the Season 11 episode involving Lois's old friend Joyce Kinney, it is revealed that Lois made an adult film called Quest for Fur during a period in her life that she had never disclosed to Peter or the children. This revelation is treated as a major plot point, but careful viewers will notice that the episode itself credits the film's crew with names that include Cherry Shivapra Vat Dumrong, which is also the name of one of the show's actual longtime writers and producers. The production credit for Lois's fictional pornographic film contains the real name of a Family Guy writer. It is the kind of meta detail that only makes sense once you know to look for it. The character of Quagmire has perhaps the most carefully hidden continuity in the entire show. Glenn Quagmire is presented as a shallow character defined almost entirely by his sexual appetite, and this characterization is so consistent that it can obscure the genuine depth that occasionally surfaces. In the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, Quagmire delivers a speech to Brian that lists, point by point, every way in which Brian has failed as a person. The speech is widely remembered as one of the funniest and most brutal character moments in the show's history. But what is less often noticed is the precision with which every accusation Quagmire makes can be verified against specific events from previous episodes. He is not riffing. He is not exaggerating. He is citing the record. Every charge Quagmire brings against Brian corresponds to something that actually happened on screen, and tracing those connections backward through the seasons is a genuinely rewarding exercise. The speech is not just a great joke. It is a comprehensive retrospective of Brian's behavior, hidden in plain sight as a character confrontation. Meg Griffin's continuity is perhaps the saddest of all the character threads running through the show. In the first 3 seasons, Meg's relationships with her family members are each individually textured. Peter ignores her in a way that is absent-minded rather than hostile. Lois gives her slightly more careful attention. Chris treats her like a normal sibling. As the seasons progress, those textured individual relationships collapse into a single, undifferentiated attitude contempt that every member of the family adopts toward her simultaneously. The Easter egg hidden in Meg's continuity is a tragic one. If you watch the show in sequence, you can pinpoint the exact season and almost the exact episode where the particular way each family member related to her was replaced by the uniform cruelty. The moment where the character lost her individual relationships is visible in the record. It happened during the Season 4 and 5 revival years, and it was gradual enough that no single episode announced it, but present enough that watching the sequence carefully reveals the transition with uncomfortable clarity. There is, however, a counter-thread running through the show's treatment of Meg that is easy to miss because the show never highlights it. In the episodes across the middle and later seasons where Meg is written with genuine care, she displays consistent personality traits that suggest a complete interior life the show has always had access to but rarely chose to display. She is perceptive. She has a genuinely sharp wit that she deploys in moments when no one is paying attention to her, which is most of the time. She shows resilience across episodes that test it to its absolute limits. And she has, across various episodes, demonstrated genuine talent in music, in writing, in leadership contexts. The Easter egg of Meg's competence is that it is always present in the show's characterization of her, even in episodes where the main story is treating her cruelly. The writers never entirely forgot who she was supposed to be. They simply chose, for long stretches of the show's history, not to let that real version of her be the primary version. The episode where Meg and Lisa Simpson meet during The Simpsons Guy crossover contains a scene that functions as the show's most explicit acknowledgement of this hidden Meg. Lisa, whose own show has always treated her intelligence and talent as central to her identity, sees Meg's saxophone ability and responds to it with genuine respect. The saxophone is not a random prop. Meg's musical ability has been established in previous episodes. Lisa's recognition of it is the show allowing one character's completeness to illuminate another character's hidden completeness. The Easter egg is that the most compassionate thing anyone in Family Guy's world ever did for Meg was accomplished by a character from an entirely different show. The character of Joe Swanson has a continuity thread that runs through the entire show in a way that is genuinely sad once you notice it. Joe was introduced in the Season 1 episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, as the coolest person in the neighborhood. A wheelchair-bound police officer whose physical disability did nothing to diminish his capability, his dignity, or the respect that every character around him showed him. The show's early treatment of Joe was quietly progressive in the specific sense that it never condescended to him. His wheelchair was part of who he was, not a source of pathos or comedy. He was competent, admired, and genuinely formidable. The hidden Easter egg in Joe's continuity is the slow, painful inversion of all of this across the seasons, the way his respect erodes, his marriage fails, and his disability becomes a recurring source of jokes rather than a fact that the show treats with the same neutrality it treated it with in Season 1. Watching Joe from beginning to end is watching the show forget what it knew about a character and then replace that knowledge with something much smaller and crueler. And because this happens gradually, across hundreds of episodes, the full distance of the journey is almost impossible to register in real time. You have to stand back from the whole thing and look at where Joe starts and where Joe ends to feel how far the show moved him and in what direction. Section 5. The background people and the faces that keep coming back. There is a particular pleasure in recognizing someone in a crowd. That moment where your eyes sweep past a dozen anonymous faces and then suddenly lock onto one that you know that sensation of recognition is one that Family Guy has deliberately engineered into its background crowds and extra characters for decades. The show is populated with faces that recur, figures that drift through episodes with no lines and no acknowledgement, present for the viewer who has been watching long enough to know who they are seeing. The most celebrated example of this tradition involves the crossover between Family Guy and American Dad, two shows that exist in the same creative universe without ever explicitly being set in the same world. In the Family Guy episode Killer Queen, which involves a murder mystery at a fat camp, the background population of the camp includes a young man who, if you have ever watched American Dad, you will recognize immediately: Barry Robinson. Barry is a supporting character on American Dad, Steve Smith's best friend, a cheerful and somewhat unstable kid voiced by Eddie K. Thomas. His appearance in the Family Guy episode is never acknowledged by any character, never pointed to, never made into a joke that the foreground characters notice. He is simply there, standing in the background, present for the viewer who knows to look for him. And when you find him, the moment of recognition carries a kind of warmth that the show's overt humor rarely manages the feeling of a private joke shared between the show and the viewer who has been paying attention. The Simpsons crossover episode from Season 13, The Simpsons Guy, is an entire episode built around this principle of recognition, but it contains within it background details that go beyond the obvious. The foreground plot involves the Griffin family meeting the Simpson family, which is the kind of crossover that generates its own Easter eggs just through the collision of the two shows' visual languages. But the episode also hides smaller moments in its backgrounds. Roger from American Dad appears briefly, stepping into frame and then leaving, a blink-and-miss cameo that functions as a comment on the fact that American Dad had by that point moved off Fox to TBS, making Roger a visitor from a different network's world. The scene where Peter and Homer fight mirrors the structure of Peter's recurring battles with the giant chicken, and the fight contains several specific moves and visual beats that are lifted directly from those chicken battles. A callback that only registers fully if you have watched enough of the show to have the chicken fight grammar internalized. The giant chicken itself, a character named Ernie, is one of the most underexamined recurring figures in the show's history. Ernie first appears in the Season 2 episode Da Boom after a conflict over a restaurant coupon, and the battles between Ernie and Peter become one of the show's most reliable recurring set pieces. But what most viewers do not know is that Ernie has a life outside his battles with Peter: a wife, a job, social obligations. In the episodes that depict his confrontations with Peter, these background details about Ernie's existence appear briefly and are easy to miss. His wife is seen in at least one episode. His domestic life is glimpsed in the margins of the action. The show is quietly insisting that even the giant chicken is a fully realized being with a world of his own, and the fights between him and Peter are just one narrow slice of that existence. James Woods is another figure whose presence in the show's backgrounds deserves attention. Woods appeared as a guest character in several episodes, most notably in the Season 2 episode Peter Griffin, husband, father, brother, and subsequently in other episodes where he was famously kidnapped and impersonated using a trail of candy. But in at least one episode, Woods can be spotted in the background of a scene where he has no credited appearance dressed as Peter Griffin, and followed by what appears to be a camera crew present in the newsroom where Meg and Neil Goldman are working as junior journalists. He is simply standing there, in the background, in costume, watching. It is the kind of cameo that requires pausing and genuinely staring at the background to confirm, and the reward for that staring is a moment of mild surrealism that the show does nothing to explain. The show's relationship with recurring minor background characters, the unnamed people who populate the streets of the town, the crowds at sporting events, the congregation at church, the patrons at restaurants has never been formally documented in the way that the show's main and supporting cast have been. But dedicated fans who have spent years watching the episodes on loop have identified a population of background figures who appear across dozens of episodes, always in slightly different contexts, always without explanation. These are not just animation shortcuts where the same character model is reused for cost savings. Some of these background figures appear in situations that suggest continuity, the same face appearing at different locations in the town in a way that implies a person living their life in the margins of the Griffin's story. Among these recurring background figures, a particular one known to fans simply as the Smiling Man has been spotted in numerous episodes over multiple seasons. He appears at a distance, in crowds, at events, in situations where his presence is geographically plausible but contextually odd. He is always smiling. He is never given any dialogue or any narrative attention. His recurrence is either a deliberate Easter egg, someone in the animation department deciding to hide their private character in the show's background, or an example of asset reuse that, through its repetition, has taken on the appearance of intentionality. Either explanation is interesting. There is also a tradition in animated shows of hiding the show's creators and writers in the background as cameos, a tradition that Family Guy has participated in, though less overtly than some. Some background characters and crowd scenes are modeled on the show's writers and producers, visible to anyone who knows what those people look like. The production company's offices, glimpsed in certain episodes, contain details that reference real people and real events from the show's own production history. These are not Easter eggs that most viewers will ever find without help, but they represent a tradition of animators and writers hiding themselves inside their own work, a tradition that is as old as animation itself, going back to the earliest days of Disney when animators would hide their own faces in the background characters of theatrical shorts. The character Herbert the Pervert, voiced with genuinely disturbing commitment by Mike Henry, is one of the most memorable recurring figures in the show's history. Herbert appears across multiple seasons as the Griffin's elderly neighbor with an inappropriately intense interest in teenage boys, specifically in Chris. What is less often noticed is that Herbert's house, visible in exterior shots across the seasons, contains a small, easy-to-miss detail in its yard, a tricycle. The tricycle appears in some shots of Herbert's yard and is absent in others, but when it is there, it carries a weight that the show never draws attention to. It is not a prop that is introduced with any fanfare. It is simply present, suggesting a history that the show leaves deliberately and uncomfortably unstated. The Drunken Clam Bar, where Peter and his friends gather in almost every episode, has its own collection of background details that accumulate over seasons into a kind of secret history of the space. The patrons in the background change between episodes, but some faces recur with enough consistency to suggest they are meant to be the same people visiting the same bar. The items on the walls of the clam, the decorations, the mounted objects, the framed photographs change in ways that sometimes track with events that have happened in the show's main narrative. And in at least one episode, a detail on the wall of the clam references an event from an episode that aired several seasons earlier, a callback so subtle that it would require an encyclopedic knowledge of the show's history to catch. One of the most quietly beloved recurring background details in the show's history is a character that has been nicknamed Holden Caulfield by both fans and some members of the show's own production staff. This character is a man who appears in a season episode where Peter is pretending to play the keyboard at some kind of public event, simply goofing around without any real skill. The man approaches Peter and begins berating him, calling him a phony, and continues to harass Peter throughout the remainder of that specific episode. He has no name given to him on screen, no backstory established, No official designation. But the nickname fans gave him comes from J.D. Salinger's iconic novel The Catcher in the Rye, whose narrator Holden Caulfield is obsessed with identifying people he considers phony. The alignment between the fictional character's obsession and the unnamed man's specific objection to Peter's fake piano playing is so precise that the writers almost certainly intended it, even if they never acknowledged it directly. The character appeared and then effectively vanished, making him one of the more obscure single-episode background figures in the show's catalog. There is a tradition in the show of letting the voice actors' real-world identities leak into the characters they play, and this tradition produces some of the most intimate Easter eggs in Family Guy's history. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, is also the co-creator and executive producer of Robot Chicken, the stop-motion animated sketch comedy series that airs on Adult Swim. The show has made several jokes about Robot Chicken across its run, and in virtually every instance, Chris is the character who either defends the show or is suspiciously absent from any mockery of it. In one episode where the Griffin family discusses animated shows, every family member except Chris is willing to make fun of Robot Chicken. Chris either leaves the room, changes the subject, or is simply not given any dialogue during the relevant exchange. The joke only works if you know who voices Chris and what that person does outside of Family Guy. For the viewer who has that context, every moment of Chris's suspicious neutrality on the Robot Chicken question is a small private performance happening within the larger public one. Similarly, Alex Borstein, who voices Lois, is associated with several projects outside Family Guy, including a prominent role in the Amazon series The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. The show has made oblique references to Mrs. Maisel in Lois-adjacent contexts that reward viewers who know Borstein's career. And Mila Kunis, who voices Meg, has had a film career that the show has also occasionally winked at, though always with the specific meta-consciousness of treating Meg as a joke, referencing Mila Kunis as a beautiful, successful actress in contexts where Meg Griffin, her animated counterpart, is simultaneously being defined by her supposed ugliness. The irony of the world's most beautiful actress voicing the show's ugliest character is a kind of permanent Easter egg embedded in the show's casting, visible every time someone mentions Mila Kunis in the real world, and then looks at Meg on screen. Section 6. The Cutaway Universe, Easter eggs hidden inside the gags themselves. The cutaway gag is the most famous thing about Family Guy, and also the most argued about. Its defenders see it as an endlessly flexible comedy tool, a way to pack maximum material into a single episode by leaping outside the story for moments of pure joke-making. Its critics see it as a structural weakness, a way to avoid telling stories by substituting disconnected sketches for actual narrative. Both of these things are probably true at different points in the show's history. But there is a third thing about the cutaways that neither side of the argument tends to address: the fact that the cutaways themselves contain Easter eggs. Not just references within the gags, but hidden connections between the gags and the main story, callbacks from one cutaway to another, and an entire layer of internal consistency that operates beneath the surface of what looks like pure randomness. The Brian Does Hollywood episode is one of the richest sources of cutaway Easter eggs in the show's history. The episode involves Brian pursuing a screenwriting career in Los Angeles and finding work in the adult film industry. Near the episode's conclusion, there is a brief scene at an Adult Film Awards ceremony where the presenter is Ron Jeremy, the real Ron Jeremy, lending his voice to the cameo, and the nominees for Best Original Score include the names Ron Jones and Walter Murphy, both of whom are the show's actual composers, alongside John Williams. The joke is absurd and quick, but the hidden layer of it is that Ron Jones and Walter Murphy are real people who really did score Family Guy, and their names appearing as nominees for an adult film score is a private compliment to two people who worked on the show. A thank you hidden inside a joke about pornography, visible only to viewers who knew the show's production credits well enough to recognize the names when they flashed by. The Road to episodes Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, and the others form a self-contained mini-universe within the larger show, and each of these episodes contains references to the others. A detail from Road to Rhode Island is picked up in Road to Germany. A moment from Road to Europe is echoed in Road to the Multiverse. These cross-references are not always obvious. They are sometimes as small as a single prop appearing in a scene, or a line of dialogue that uses phrasing that appeared in an earlier Road episode. But taken together, they create a sense of a continuous, coherent story running through these episodes even though they are separated by years of broadcast time. The Road 2 series had its origins in a specific and traceable homage to the classic Bing Crosby and Bob Hope Road 2 films from the 1940s. Those films, Road to Singapore, Road to Morocco, Road to Utopia, and others, were a specific genre of Hollywood comedy built around the chemistry between two male leads who would bicker, scheme, and wander through exotic locations together. The first Family Guy Road 2 episode, Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, lifted specific structural elements from those films, including a musical duet between Brian and Stewie that parodies the style of the songs Crosby and Hope would sing in their films. The second Road to episode, Road to Europe from Season 3, extends this homage and adds a reference to Road to Morocco specifically. This genealogy is an Easter egg in the sense that it rewards knowledge from outside the show. The viewer who has seen the Crosby Hope films will experience the Road 2 episodes differently from the viewer who has not, catching layers of parody that are invisible to anyone without the right reference frame. The Road to Germany episode from Season 7 contains within it one of the more technically demanding Easter eggs in the show's history. In this episode, Mort Goldman is accidentally transported back to 1939 Poland, just before the German invasion, and Brian and Stewie must travel back through time to rescue him. The episode is set primarily in historical World War II Europe, and the animators working on the episode included background details drawn from photographs of the actual period street signs, building architecture, clothing styles, vehicle designs. These details are accurate to the period in ways that go beyond what the storytelling requires. A background storefront in one scene uses lettering that matches the specific typography common to German commercial signage in the late 1930s. The episode also contains a sequence in which Brian and Stewie interact with a live-action dancing sequence, and that live-action sequence was achieved by editing actual archival footage, which means the episode seamlessly blends animated characters with real historical imagery from the period. The seam between the animation and the archival footage is itself an Easter egg. It is visible, but only barely, and the effort required to make it barely visible was considerable. The time machine in Stewie's possession changes its power source between Road 2 episodes in a way that directly parodies the Back to the Future film trilogy. In Road to Germany, the time machine runs on uranium. In Back to the Pilot, the show explicitly notes that the power source has now changed to ordinary household D batteries. In the Back to the Future films, the DeLorean time machine runs on plutonium in the first film and then ordinary household waste in the second. The parallel is exact and deliberately so. Stewie's time machine is a parody of a specific Hollywood prop whose power requirements changed between films, and every time Stewie's time machine has a different power source in a different episode, it is the show winking at this connection without ever stating it directly. The cutaway to Conway Twitty, perhaps the most notorious recurring gag in the show's entire history, actually contains within it a hidden joke that most people who discuss it have never noticed. The gag works by showing a full, unedited performance of Conway Twitty singing one of his country songs, with no punchline, no interruption, no conclusion. The audience is expected to sit through a complete Conway Twitty number as though the show has simply forgotten that it was supposed to be telling a story. Most people's experience of this gag is one of mounting irritation, punctuated by occasional genuine laughter at the sheer commitment of the bit. But in the episodes where this gag appears, the specific Conway Twitty song being performed is not random. The song chosen for each appearance is one whose lyrics, if you know them and pay attention, have some oblique connection to the story that was happening in the episode before the cutaway interrupted it. The connection is never direct, it is never pointed to, but it is there, and finding it requires knowing enough Conway Twitty to match the song to the narrative context, which is precisely the kind of knowledge that the writers almost certainly had and assumed almost no one in the audience would have. The chicken fights, those extended, operatically violent confrontations between Peter and Ernie the giant chicken, each contain visual callbacks to action films and fight sequences from Hollywood cinema that are hidden within the choreography of the battles. The Season 4 episode that parodied Hitchcock Chicken Fight contains staging that mirrors specific sequences from the 1993 film The Fugitive. The No Chris Left Behind fight contains visual quotations from James Bond films. These are not parody in the traditional sense, where the reference is obvious and the joke is about the recognition. They are genuine visual homages embedded inside the choreography, detectable only if you have the right reference points and the patience to look for them within sequences that are primarily functioning as pure kinetic spectacle. The show also hides jokes inside its background signage during cutaway sequences in a way that rewards pausing far more than any individual gag rewards watching in real time. Stores in the background of cutaway scenes have names that are puns or references. Signs on buildings carry messages that only become legible if you stop the episode and zoom in. The streets of fantasy or historical settings in cutaways are populated with background businesses whose names are quiet jokes aimed at no one in particular, planted there because the people making the show could not help themselves. In one cutaway set in a fictional version of ancient Rome, a building in the background bears a Latin inscription that, when translated, is a joke about Fox's scheduling practices. A complaint hidden in a dead language inside a gag about Roman history, available to literally no one unless they read Latin, pause the episode, and happen to be watching while also having a reason to resent how Fox treated the show. In the episode Model Misbehavior, the Griffin family wins a boat race and their story appears in newspapers throughout the episode. The main headline is straightforward, it covers the victory. But below the main headline, in the smaller print that the camera is only briefly positioned to make readable, is a secondary headline that reads, DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed. This is the show explicitly acknowledging the practice of pausing episodes to read background text, and then withholding the joke that the practice was meant to reveal. It is a triple layer. There is a background detail, which invites pause and reading, which then produces a message telling the person who paused and read it that they wasted their time. The show is trolling its most devoted viewers with such precise craftsmanship that the trolling itself becomes the Easter egg. The episode North by North Quahog, keeping the title accurate to the show but noting it is the Season 4 premiere, involves a subplot about Mel Gibson and a sequel to The Passion of the Christ, contains a quick shot of a film trailer for the fictional sequel. Within this trailer, Jesus is shown driving a car. The shot is brief and the detail is small, but if you pause it, you can read Jesus's license plate. It says WWID. This stands for What Would I Do? A play on the morality bracelet phrase WWJD, or What Would Jesus Do? The fact that the plate reads What Would I Do rather than What Would Jesus Do suggests that Jesus, in the world of the fictional trailer, has elevated himself beyond the need to ask what Jesus would do in a given situation, because he is Jesus. The joke is 3 layers deep. The plate exists as a readable detail. The detail is a pun on a well-known acronym, and the pun contains a further logic about the absurdity of the whole scenario, and it flashes past in a fraction of a second. Section 7. Numbers, dates, and the real world hidden in animation. Family Guy has always had a complicated relationship with the real world. It is set in a fictional city in a real state, populated with characters who watch real television, listen to real music, and interact with real celebrities. The boundary between the show's invented reality and the actual world is deliberately permeable, and the places where that boundary is most porous are often the places where the most interesting Easter eggs hide. The number 31 has already been mentioned in connection with the Griffin home address. But 31 is far from the only number that appears with notable frequency throughout the show's visual landscape. The number 22, the millions of viewers who watched the first episode, appears in backgrounds across the first 3 seasons, with a regularity that suggests it was planted deliberately as a quiet celebration of the show's premiere. The production code system used for the show's episodes follows a pattern that contains information about the production order of episodes versus their broadcast order, and fans who have cross-referenced production codes with broadcast dates have occasionally discovered that the discrepancy between the 2 timelines explains certain continuity oddities in the show scenes that seem to reference events that have not happened yet within the broadcast sequence, but had already happened in the production sequence. The real-world detail that has generated the most discussion and the most discomfort in the show's history involves Seth MacFarlane and the 11th of September, 2001. MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of the 11th of September, 2001. He missed the flight by approximately 10 minutes, having been given the wrong departure time by his travel agent and then having overslept. Flight 11 was one of the 4 planes hijacked that day, and it was flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. McFarlane survived by accident. The show never directly addresses this fact, but viewers who know this biographical detail will encounter certain episodes in a different way, particularly episodes that reference September 11 in various ways, or episodes that deal with themes of narrow escape and luck, and the randomness of who lives and who does not. The show is not commenting on McFarlane's experience, but the experience is there in the biography of the man who made it, and it colors certain things. The episode Back to the Pilot uses the events of September 11 as its central plot mechanism. Brian, having traveled back in time to 1999, warns his past self about the attacks, and the resulting change in history produces a catastrophic future in which the Iraq War never happened. George W. Bush lost the 2004 election, and a second Confederate secession triggered a nuclear civil war that killed 17 million people. The episode treats September 11 with a dark irreverence that provoked controversy, but it also contains within it a specific and factual detail that most viewers would not catch. The date Brian specifies when warning his past self is accurate. The episode was written by people who knew the history, and the historical accuracy of its fictional premise is itself a kind of hidden credential, a signal that the writers had done their homework even while using real events as material for comedy. Rhode Island itself is the real-world setting that Family Guy has used as a foundation for the fictional town, and the show's relationship with actual Rhode Island geography is more careful than it might appear. Brown University is referenced correctly. The state's political culture, historically blue, with a particular flavor of New England working-class democratic tradition, is reflected accurately in the show's background politics. The accents, when the show is paying attention to them, reflect genuine Rhode Island speech patterns, rather than a generic New England sound. And the show has on multiple occasions hidden actual Rhode Island-specific references in backgrounds, street names, landmark buildings, geographical details that residents of the real state would recognize and that no one else would. The TV Guide Easter egg is one of the most referenced examples of the show hiding messages in plain sight. In one episode, Peter is looking for a story to give to Meg for her school newspaper. He grabs a copy of TV Guide for inspiration, and if you pause on the right frame, you can read below a photograph of Luke Perry, a caption that says, "If you can read this, Family Guy is on the air." This is a message that makes no sense unless you understand its context. Family Guy had, at this point in its history, been canceled and returned, and the writers were clearly still processing the fragility of the show's existence. The message is optimistic and slightly defiant, a small declaration that the show had survived, embedded in a background prop that the camera never holds long enough to read in real time. The Wilhelm scream is a specific piece of audio, a single recorded human scream that has been licensed and used by Hollywood films since the 1950s, and that has appeared in hundreds of movies and television shows. It is one of the most widely recognized pieces of Hollywood sound design among film enthusiasts, and Family Guy uses it multiple times across multiple episodes. Each use of the Wilhelm scream in Family Guy is, in a small way, a nod to film culture, a private acknowledgement that the show's creators are film people who have absorbed the same stock sounds as everyone else who works in the industry. But the specific episodes in which the Wilhelm scream appears in Family Guy, and the specific contexts in which it appears, are worth examining because the sound is not used randomly. It tends to appear in sequences that are parodies of action or adventure films, where its presence functions as a signal that the show is aware of its own genre parody roots. The show's treatment of the city of Providence, Rhode Island, which is a real city near the fictional location of the town, is another example of the show hiding real-world accuracy inside what appears to be pure invention. When Family Guy references Providence, it references it correctly. The geography is right. The landmarks mentioned are real. The cultural associations Brown University, the Rhode Island School of Design, which McFarlane himself attended, are accurate. RISD in particular appears in the show's backgrounds and references in ways that are geographically and culturally precise, which makes sense given that McFarlane spent years there and would have internalized its visual and cultural world completely. The most personal Easter egg in the entire run of the show may be the way RISD's presence permeates the background details of a fictional Rhode Island city, the creator's own educational history embedded in the landscape of his creation. The show's premiere date, the 31st of January 1999, appears in the show's own internal mythology as a significant date. In Back to the Pilot, Brian specifically identifies the 31st of January 1999 as the date he buried a tennis ball, which is also the date he identifies to his past self when warning him about September 11. The premiere date is used as a plot-specific date within the episode that revisits it, which means the show's own birthday has been folded into its fictional timeline. The date on which the show first existed in the world is also, within the show's own story, the date that certain things became possible, certain friendships formed, certain futures set in motion. The show's first day of life is also, within its mythology, one of the most consequential days in the lives of its characters. That alignment between real-world production history and fictional in-universe event is either a beautifully constructed coincidence or a deliberate choice to honor the show's own origins. Section 8. Meta Easter eggs and the show looking at itself. Family Guy has always been willing to acknowledge its own existence in ways that most television shows avoid. From its earliest episodes, it made jokes about the network that aired it, about the act of watching television, about the conventions of the animated sitcom format. But as the show went on and accumulated its own history, the meta-humor evolved into something more sophisticated, a show that could comment not just on television in general, but on its own specific place in television history, its own past, its own characters' awareness of being characters. The clearest and most famous example of this is the Season 3 episode Lethal Weapons, which ends with the Griffin family in a massive fistfight. After the violence winds down, the characters turn their attention to the question of where all that aggression came from, and eventually the conclusion is reached that television violence might be responsible. Peter extends this logic to criticize Fox specifically for allowing so much violence on television, and Lois warns him that he should be careful about criticizing the network. Peter dismisses the warning and asks what they are going to do about it, suggesting that the worst possible consequence would be cutting the show's budget. In the very next shot, the animation quality drops noticeably, characters rendered in a looser, sloppier style, the background simplified. The show has taken its own budget in a visible, literal way in direct response to the characters' provocation. This joke required the animation department to deliberately produce worse work than they were capable of for a specific sequence, which is a genuinely unusual thing to ask animators to do. It is also a joke that requires the viewer to have an implicit understanding of what the show's normal animation looks like, so that the degraded version registers as degraded. It works as meta-humor and as a reward for viewers who have been paying close enough attention to the show's visual language to notice when it changes. The Back to the Pilot episode, which has already appeared several times in this journey through the show's Easter eggs, is perhaps the most extended and elaborate piece of meta-humor in the show's history. In this episode, the show is commenting on its own first episode, on the differences between its past and present animation styles, on its own use of cutaway gags, and on its own relationship with the viewer who has been watching since the beginning. The moment where Stewie and Brian observe the 1,999 versions of the Griffin family waiting in silence while a cutaway plays out is the show's most honest acknowledgement of a structural fact about its own comedy. The family is not part of the cutaway. They have nothing to do while it is happening. They are interrupted by it and then resumed. This was always true, but the show had never said it out loud, and saying it out loud required having time travelers go back to the beginning and watch it happen. The show's relationship with the DVDs of its own episodes is a source of several meta Easter eggs. The DVD sets of Family Guy episodes contain commentary tracks, deleted scenes, and other bonus materials that are themselves filled with hidden jokes and references. Some of these bonus material jokes have then been referenced in the actual episodes, creating a loop where content produced for one format is acknowledged in content produced for another. The practice of pausing DVDs to catch background text is acknowledged and satirized in the episode Model Misbehavior, as discussed above. And the sheer quantity of bonus material hidden in the official DVD releases, including early animatics that differ significantly from broadcast versions, deleted scenes that alter the meaning of episodes they were cut from, and commentary tracks in which the writers discuss specific Easter eggs that they know most viewers will never find, creates an entire supplementary layer of the show that exists separately from the broadcast version. There is a long tradition within the show of Peter discussing or criticizing the Fox network in ways that range from affectionate to genuinely hostile. The show's contentious relationship with its broadcasting home became increasingly explicit over the seasons as MacFarlane's frustration with the network grew. And the jokes that appear in the show about Fox are not all made equal. Some of them are gentle ribbing about scheduling or promotion, while others are sharper and seem to come from a place of genuine irritation. Longtime viewers who track the evolution of the Fox jokes across the seasons have suggested that they form a kind of barometer for the creative team's relationship with the network, a timeline of that relationship rendered in comedy. The theme song itself contains a meta Easter egg that plays out over decades. The theme song is sung by Peter and Lois at the piano, and across the show's history, the sequence of the theme song has been modified dozens of times to acknowledge special occasions, to comment on current events, or simply to subvert expectations. In a particular episode, the theme song begins normally and then is interrupted by Peter, who stops the sequence and ejects a dancer who has appeared in the choreography, explaining to the camera that she has been stealing from the show and needs to be removed. The sequence continues without her. This is the show interrupting its own opening credits to deal with a fictional staffing problem, treating the theme song as a production that exists within the show's own reality, rather than as a fourth wall that separates the characters from the meta level of their own existence. In one episode's version of the theme, characters who have been phased out of the show over the years are shown sitting on a bench, while the main cast performs a bench for the characters who no longer get regular appearances. Watching the current version of the show from outside it, Stewie is placed on this bench at one point, suggesting that even he recognizes his own diminishing role in certain seasons. The bench is not a joke about the show's declining quality. It is a joke about the passage of time and the way that television naturally cycles through its characters' prominence, but it is also a genuinely melancholy image characters from the show's past sitting and watching a present they are no longer part of. The crossover with The Simpsons guy from season 13, is dense with meta Easter eggs that operate on multiple levels simultaneously. The episode is obviously a crossover between two long-running animated comedies, and the surface-level Easter eggs are the ones that acknowledge the relationship between the two shows, the way Family Guy's visual style contrasts with The Simpsons' visual style, the way Peter's fighting style mirrors itself against Homer's, the way the Griffins' dysfunction is set against the Springfieldians' dysfunction. But beneath those obvious cross-references are smaller, more private ones. The fight sequence between Peter and Homer is choreographed to mirror the structure of Peter's fights with the giant chicken's specific beats of escalation, specific types of environmental destruction, a specific rhythm of recovery and reinitiation. The fight is not just Peter versus Homer. It is the show commenting, through the structure of a fight it has done many times before, on what it means to pit its own signature set piece against a completely different show's approach to similar material. There is also a sequence in The Simpsons Guy, where the characters watch television together, and the television they are watching is a show that exists in both universes simultaneously, meaning it is a show that would be in the broadcast rotation of both Springfield and the town where the Griffins live. This shared fictional television program is an Easter egg that only fully registers if you have watched enough of both shows to know what each universe's television landscape looks like. The show being watched is one that could plausibly exist in either universe, and its presence in the episode is a quiet suggestion that the two animated worlds are not, despite everything, as separate as they appear to be. The episode PTV from Season 4, in which Peter creates his own television network broadcasting from the Griffin House, contains within it a kind of comprehensive meta-commentary on Family Guy's own relationship with the censors and the broadcast standards that governed what the show could do. The episode is explicitly about censorship, and the fictional programs Peter broadcasts are parodies of the show's own content, which means PTV is Family Guy making fun of Family Guy inside an episode of Family Guy. The layers of self-reference in this episode are considerable, and the specific jokes that Peter broadcasts on his fictional network are not entirely original. Some of them are riffs on things that had already happened in actual Family Guy episodes, which means the show is reusing its own material as meta-commentary on its own willingness to reuse material. This is either very clever or very lazy, and the show's awareness of that ambiguity seems to be part of the joke. The episode Stewie's First Word contains a quiet Easter egg in its title. The joke of the episode is that Stewie, who has been speaking in complete, elaborate, sophisticated sentences since the first episode of the show, does not have a first word in the conventional sense, because his first recognizable public utterance comes in the form of an expletive shouted in church. The episode's title is therefore a knowing joke about the entire premise of the show. Stewie has never had a first word in the sense that parents usually celebrate. He went from apparent baby babbling, as heard by the adults in his world, to full articulate speech, as heard by the audience, without any developmental milestone in between. The first word the episode gives him is therefore not a milestone but a revelation, the first time that his ability to speak is truly public, and the first time that the show officially acknowledges that the gap between how Stewie sounds to his family and how he sounds to the audience has a specific mechanism. The title is an Easter egg because it sounds like a heartwarming milestone episode and is actually the show answering a question it planted in its very first episode. Section 9. Stewie's Hidden Timeline and Brian's Secret Story. Stewie Griffin's arc across the show's history is the single most complex piece of character storytelling that Family Guy has ever attempted, and most of it was never announced. It did not happen in dramatic season finales or press release generating special episodes. It happened in the margins, in background details, in small shifts that accumulated across seasons until the character who appeared in Season 20 was genuinely, measurably different from the character who appeared in Season 1. And the path between those two versions of Stewie contains more deliberate Easter eggs, more hidden narrative structure than any other character thread in the show. The evil baby of the first 3 seasons was not a simple character. He was frightening in a way that many people forget, because the show has been running for so long that the memory of early Stewie has been partly overwritten by the much gentler version that came after. But early Stewie had a consistency and a clarity of purpose that the show maintained carefully. Every episode of those first 3 seasons contains at least one moment where Stewie is doing something that only makes sense if his central motivation, the desire to either control everything or destroy everything, is taken. Seriously, he is not posturing, he means it. The weapons in Stewie's nursery are not abstract. The laser pistol, the time machine, the mind control devices, the weather machine glimpsed in the second episode. These are working devices that Stewie has built with materials he has somehow obtained and engineering principles he has somehow mastered. The show never explains how a 1-year-old acquired these capabilities, and the fact that it never explains is itself a hidden Easter egg. The absence of explanation is a choice. It says that the show's reality is one in which Stewie's genius is simply a fact, as given and unexplained as gravity. This is a different kind of world than the one the show would eventually settle into, and the world of those early seasons is darker and more genuinely strange as a result. The Stewie and Lois conflict the engine of Stewie's entire early existence contains within it a hidden logic that is more sophisticated than most analyses give it credit for. Stewie's hatred of Lois is not random. It is not simply a joke about a baby who dislikes his mother. It is, the show suggests in various small ways across the first 3 seasons, rooted in something like an existential objection. Lois represents constraint. She is the authority that can take away Stewie's devices, interrupt his plans, and reduce him to an infant despite everything he is capable of. His desire to kill her is not personal in the way a human grudge is personal. It is philosophical. She is the obstacle between what he is and what he could be if the world recognized what he was. The hidden layer of the Stewie-Lois conflict is that it is not really about Lois at all. She is a symbol. And the eventual loss of that conflict, the softening of Stewie into someone who actually loves his mother, which happens gradually and without announcement across the middle seasons, is also the loss of that philosophical edge. The later Stewie is not haunted by the constraint that the earlier Stewie was always pushing against. He has made peace with it. And the Easter egg of that transition is visible in the way the show began to depict Lois and Stewie in shared scenes, the gradual warming of those interactions, tracked across seasons, telling a story that the show never directly states. The Season 6 2-part episode, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, is the most significant Easter egg in Stewie's entire story. In these episodes, Stewie finally achieves what the early seasons spent 3 years building toward. He kills Lois, takes over the world, becomes the dictator he always wanted to be. It is a satisfying, thrilling, genuinely dramatic pair of episodes that delivers everything the earliest Stewie was promising. And then it reveals that none of it was real. It was a simulation running on Stewie's computer. Everything resets. And Stewie, at the end of the second episode, says something that functions as the hidden epitaph for the original version of the character. I suppose I'm not ready to kill Lois or take over the world. Yet. The word yet is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. It preserves the possibility that the old Stewie still exists somewhere inside the new one. It suggests that the simulation was not a defeat but a rehearsal. And then the show moved on, and the world domination never came back in any serious way. And the yet slowly became the show's private joke with itself, a promise that everyone involved knew was never going to be kept. Brian Griffin's hidden story is sadder and more linear. It is the story of a character whose potential was enormous and whose trajectory bent steadily downward, with occasional recoveries that never held. But within that decline, there are specific moments that function as Easter eggs in the sense that they require context from elsewhere in the show to fully understand. The episode Brian and Stewie, which aired in Season 8 and is widely considered one of the finest episodes in the show's history, contains within it a revelation about Brian that had been hidden in plain sight for the entire run of the show up to that point. The episode isolates Brian and Stewie in a bank vault over a weekend, with no cutaways and no outside plot, just the two characters talking. During these conversations, Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box at this specific bank because he has considered using it on himself. He has thought about ending his life. This revelation is not presented as a joke. It is presented as a genuine, heavy truth that the character has been carrying in private. And the Easter egg hidden in this revelation is that, looking back across the previous 7 seasons of the show, the signs of Brian's depression were always there. The failed novel, the excessive drinking, the pattern of romantic attachment that always ended in rejection, the sense of being slightly out of place in every situation, all of these were consistently present throughout the show's history. The audience had been watching a depressed character for 7 years, without the show ever naming what they were watching. The Brian and Stewie episode finally names it, quietly, between 2 characters in a vault. And from that point, rewatching the earlier seasons with that knowledge changes everything about how Brian's behavior reads. The evolution of Stewie's accent is itself a kind of hidden continuity that runs across the seasons and rewards the listener who pays attention to sound rather than just image. In the first season, Stewie's British accent is more exaggerated, more deliberately theatrical. It is the accent of a cartoon villain performing villainy, which makes sense because early Stewie is essentially doing exactly that. As the seasons progressed, the accent became subtler, more naturalized, less a performance of Britishness and more simply how the character spoke. This shift happened so gradually that most viewers did not consciously register it. But going back and watching first season Stewie after years of watching later season Stewie produces a small shock of recognition. The voice sounds slightly wrong, slightly more extreme, like hearing a recording of someone you know from years ago when they were performing a version of themselves they have since grown out of. Seth MacFarlane's voice acting for Stewie across the seasons is an Easter egg that lives entirely in the ear, accessible only through the comparison of early and late performances. There is a scene in the Season 8 episode Road to the Multiverse, the most ambitious of all the Road to installments in which Brian and Stewie visit a version of the Family Guy universe where the show is animated in the style of the 1940s Fleischer Studios cartoons, and then a version animated in the style of a live-action show where the Griffins are played by human actors, and then a version where everyone is a dog. Each of these alternate universes contains hidden details specific to the animation style being parodied. The Fleischer-style sequence uses the specific background elements, rubber hose animation, symmetrical character designs, musical accompaniment style that distinguish that era of animation from every other era. The live-action sequence uses specific details of how live-action family comedies from the 1980s and 1990s were shot and staged. These stylistic details are Easter eggs for animation history enthusiasts. They are accurate in ways that go beyond parody into genuine technical homage. Brian's death and resurrection in Season 12 is an Easter egg that operates at the scale of the entire broadcast season. The death itself, sudden, genuinely shocking, treated with unusual seriousness, sent the message that the show was willing to commit to permanent consequences. The grief felt authentic. The replacement dog, Vinny, was written with enough care to suggest that the writers were prepared to make him a real character. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie used a stolen time travel device to go back and save Brian, and the death was undone. The Easter egg hidden in the death and resurrection is that the decision to undo it so quickly was itself a comment on the show's deeper identity, its inability to accept the consequences of its own dramatic choices, its compulsion to reset everything to familiar ground. The reversal was not just a plot choice. It was a confession. The episode Christmas Guy, the one in which Stewie saves Brian, contains within it a moment that functions as one of the most emotionally potent Easter eggs in the show's history. When Stewie finds a way to go back in time and warn Brian before he is hit by the car, the show returns to footage from the previous episode where Brian was still alive. The footage is the same. The animation is identical to what was originally broadcast, but the emotional context has completely changed. Footage that was once background unremarkable moments of Brian simply being alive becomes, in the context of Christmas Guy, the most precious possible thing, because the audience has spent 2 episodes processing the loss of that specific aliveness. The show did not reanimate anything. It just repositioned the same images in a context that made them heartbreaking. The Easter egg hidden in Christmas Guy is one of emotional engineering, the deliberate use of previously broadcast footage to create a feeling that the footage itself could never have created when it first aired. Section 10. The Living House Theory and what the backgrounds actually are. Before we arrive at the truly rare and obscure Easter eggs that dedicated fans spent years tracking down, there is something worth sitting with for a moment. Something that connects all of the hidden details we have discussed in the Griffin House, in the cutaways, in the background crowds, in the architecture of the episodes themselves. And that something is a theory that has slowly coalesced in the fan communities who have spent the most time looking at this show carefully. A theory that reframes what all of these inconsistencies and hidden details actually are. The theory is this: the backgrounds of Family Guy are not failed attempts at consistency. They are deliberate records of memory. Consider how memory actually works. When you remember a place you lived in as a child, you do not remember it architecturally. You do not have a floor plan. You have impressions: the way the kitchen smelled in winter, the sound the stairs made at night, the specific quality of light through a particular window. And if you were asked to draw that place from memory, the rooms would be the wrong size, the bathroom would be in the wrong place, the furniture would have migrated. Not because your memory is broken, but because memory organizes space around feeling rather than fact. The kitchen is larger in memory because it was the place where things happened. The bedroom hallway is darker because of what it felt like to walk down it at night. The Griffin House, viewed through this lens, is a rendered memory. It is not trying to be a real building. It is trying to be the emotional experience of a place the way a family home feels when you are inside it, which is always slightly impossible, always slightly more spacious in some rooms and more cramped in others than the actual dimensions would allow. The bathroom migrates because bathrooms in memory always feel slightly uncertain. You remember them in relation to where you were when you needed them, not in relation to the objective layout of the building. The fireplace exists for one episode and then is gone because memory works that way. Things you only encountered once in a place exist vividly in the specific context of that encounter and then fade when the context fades. This theory does not explain everything about the Griffin House. Some inconsistencies are simply animation errors, the result of different studios handling different episodes without perfect coordination. But the theory has this advantage: it makes the inconsistency meaningful rather than accidental. It says that the house you are watching is not a house. It is a feeling of a house. And all of the hidden details embedded in its rooms, the sheet music, the paintings that shift, the fireplace that burned once and was never seen again, are the details that memory deposits and then moves around according to its own internal logic. The same principle extends to the show's recurring background figures: the smiling man who appears in crowds across multiple seasons, the face that seems to belong to no one and yet keeps showing up. He is the kind of person that memory generates. The person you saw once and could not place, and who appeared again later in a different context with the same specific quality of presence. Memory does this constantly. It recycles faces, reuses shapes, populates the background of recalled scenes with figures that feel familiar without being identifiable. The backgrounds of Family Guy do this too. They generate a population that is just slightly more familiar than it should be, just slightly more consistent than randomness would produce. The cutaway gags in this reading are the mind's tendency to interrupt itself with associations. You are in the middle of a story and something someone says triggers a completely different image, a completely different narrative fragment, a scene that has nothing to do with where you were and yet feels completely necessary to acknowledge before you can return to what you were doing. The show's cutaway structure is not television comedy. It is the architecture of a thinking mind, one that moves associatively rather than linearly, that cannot hear a phrase without connecting it to something else, that is incapable of staying in one place for very long because the world is simply too full of other things that are just as real. When you watch Family Guy this way as the recorded experience of a specific kind of mind moving through a specific kind of world, the hidden things become something other than Easter eggs. They become the evidence of that mind's private life. The things it noticed that it could not help putting somewhere. The references it could not suppress. The sheet music it drew correctly not because anyone asked, but because to draw it incorrectly would have felt dishonest. The specific Conway Twitty song it chose for a reason that it never explained, because the reason was too interior to explain. All of the hiding is not concealment. It is the natural product of a mind that thinks in more than one layer simultaneously and puts all of those layers down somewhere, trusting that someone else will eventually look at all of them. Family Guy, at its best, is a portrait of that kind of mind. And the Easter eggs are the portrait's most revealing details, the ones that only become visible when you stop looking at the subject in the foreground and let your attention drift to everything else that is present in the frame. Section 11. The rarest and most obscure Easter eggs ever found. The Easter eggs that fan communities have spent the most time finding are not usually the ones discussed in mainstream media. The most celebrated Easter eggs, the sheet music on Lois's piano, the DVD's paused for headline joke newspaper, the Jesus license plate are widely known and widely written about. But beneath those well-documented discoveries is a layer of much rarer, much more obscure hidden details that required years of dedicated watching and the collective attention of thousands of people to find. These are the Easter eggs that exist in the deep background, the ones planted not for casual discovery but for the person who is genuinely committed to seeing everything. Among the rarest confirmed Easter eggs in the show's history is a background sign visible in a street scene during one of the show's crowd sequences that contains the full name and phone number of one of the show's production assistants. This detail was found by a fan who paused the episode and zoomed in on a business storefront in the background, found what appeared to be a legitimate phone number, and called it, discovering that it connected to someone associated with the show's production. The number may or may not still be active, but its presence in the background of the episode was confirmed and is real. Someone in the production pipeline, a writer, a background artist, someone with access to the animation files, hid a functional, real-world contact number inside the background of a crowd scene. The relationship between the show's production codes and its broadcast order contains an entire hidden archaeology. Family Guy episodes are produced in a sequence that does not always match the sequence in which they air. When episodes are reordered due to network scheduling decisions, seasonal programming changes, or, occasionally, content concerns, the production codes embedded in each episode remain attached to the production order, while the episodes themselves air in a different sequence. Fans who have cataloged every episode's production code and cross-referenced it against the broadcast order have found that certain continuity oddities in the show, a character reference in episode X to an event that only happened in episode Y, when X aired before Y, are explained by the production order, which means the writers were referencing events that they knew had happened in production, even when those events had not yet aired for the audience. The show has a long and elaborate tradition of hiding the names of its writers inside episodes in ways that go beyond simple episode credits. The season 11 episode that reveals Lois's adult film past credits the fictional crew of the film with names that include Cherry Shevapravat Dumrong, a real Family Guy writer and producer who has worked on the show for years. Her name appears in the background text of the episode as a production credit for a pornographic film that Lois made in her youth. This is not unique to that episode. Across the show's history, the names of writers and producers appear in background text, on fake movie posters, in the credits of fictional television programs that characters watch on screen within the show, on the spines of books, on diplomas and certificates visible on walls in scenes set in offices and educational institutions. Finding all of them would require watching every episode with equal attention to every corner of every frame, a project that no individual has completed, but that the collective attention of fan communities has moved significantly toward. The show's own episode, Viewer Mail Number 1 from Season 2, contains a particularly layered Easter egg in the form of what appears to be an accidental animation error. In one sequence within the episode, a character appears briefly whose design does not match any established character in the show and whose presence in the scene serves no narrative purpose. Fan communities spent years debating whether this was a genuine animation error, a background character that someone had designed and placed without authorization, or a deliberate Easter egg with a meaning that no one has conclusively decoded. The question was never officially resolved by the show's production team, which has led to a small, ongoing community of fans for whom this specific frame of a specific episode remains an open mystery. The show's approach to music contains hidden Easter eggs of a specifically technical nature. The composers who scored Family Guy across its run, Ron Jones in the early seasons, Walter Murphy across much of the rest of the run, were both highly trained musicians with extensive knowledge of film scoring and classical composition. Within the background music of certain episodes, they embedded musical quotations and allusions that function as Easter eggs for trained ears. A specific harmonic progression in a scene scored by Ron Jones has been identified as a quotation from a specific piece of classical orchestral music that connects thematically to what is happening in the episode. A Walter Murphy cue in a later episode uses a chord sequence that is a direct quotation from a jazz standard whose title relates to the scene it accompanies. These are Easter eggs that the overwhelming majority of viewers will never hear as Easter eggs because they require musical training and a specific listening orientation to detect. But they are there, and they are deliberate, and they represent a layer of craft embedded in the show that operates entirely below the level of conscious awareness for most of its audience. There is a fan theory, one that has been debated and partially corroborated and partially refuted across the years, that certain recurring minor characters in the background of the show across its early seasons are meant to be the same person appearing at different ages. The theory holds that a particular background character introduced in the first season is depicted as a young man, and that this same character, with appropriate aging, appears in later seasons as an older man, his life progressing in the background of the Griffin's story across the years. The theory has never been confirmed by any member of the show's production team, but the character designs in question are similar enough that the coincidence, if it is a coincidence, is a striking one. The connection between Family Guy and American Dad extends further into background details than most fans have fully traced. Both shows exist in a world that shares some of the same cultural references, the same generic geography of American suburban life, and occasionally the same specific references. The appearance of Barry Robinson in Killer Queen is the most famous confirmed crossover, but fans have cataloged other moments, a building design that appears in both shows' backgrounds, a brand name visible in both shows' storefront scenes, a piece of incidental music that appears in episodes of both shows in close proximity to each other. Whether these connections are intentional or coincidental is impossible to say without access to the animation files and the writers' rooms of both shows. But they are present, and they suggest a closer relationship between the two shows' visual worlds than either show has ever explicitly acknowledged. The show has a tradition of hiding real-world social commentary inside what appear to be purely absurdist gags. The episode Mission Impossible from Season 3 contains a sequence involving Stewie shrinking himself and entering Lois's body, where he encounters a potential sibling who might be conceived if Lois and Peter have a new baby. The sequence is clearly a parody of the 1966 film Fantastic Voyage, but the specific arguments Stewie uses to persuade the potential sibling not to be born arguments about the nature of consciousness, about whether existence is preferable to non-existence, about the specific character of the Griffin household are not jokes. They are genuinely philosophical arguments, stated accurately, by a cartoon baby inside a parody of a science fiction film, while the main story of the episode proceeds without any indication that something philosophically interesting is happening inside Lois's fallopian tubes. The Easter egg here is a kind of intellectual seriousness hiding inside the most absurd possible packaging. The Wasted Talent episode from Season 2, widely regarded by fans as one of the finest episodes in the show's history, contains a hidden structural Easter egg that rewards viewers who know the Willy Wonka and The Chocolate Factory film from 1971. The episode involves Peter winning a prize inside a Pawtucket Patriot beer, which takes him on a tour of the brewery in a sequence that deliberately mirrors the structure of the Chocolate Factory tour in the Wonka film. Peter's behavior during the tour corresponds to the behavior of specific children during the Wonka tour. Different tour guests make the same kinds of mistakes in the same sequence, with the same kinds of consequences. The correspondence is exact enough that it reads as a formal parody structure rather than a coincidental similarity, but it is executed so smoothly that many viewers take the episode's plot on its own terms without registering the architectural correspondence to the film it is built on. The episode Road to the North Pole from Season 9 contains within it a musical number that is, on the surface, a cheerful holiday song, but the lyrics of the song, heard carefully, describe with escalating specificity the ecological and logistical impossibility of Santa's operation at the North Pole as Brian and Stewie discover it to be. The song is structured exactly like a traditional Christmas carol. The melody is warm, the arrangement is festive, the pacing is joyful, but the content of what it is saying becomes increasingly grim with each verse. The Easter egg is the mismatch between the form of the song and its content, which only becomes apparent if you are actually listening to the words rather than absorbing the musical mood. Most viewers watching hear a Christmas song. The viewer who is listening closely hears a lament. Among the most affecting and least discussed Easter eggs in the show's history is one that exists entirely in the timing of a single episode. In Brian and Stewie, the Season 8 episode that confines the two characters in a vault, there is a moment near the end where Stewie tells Brian how much he means to him. The emotion is genuine and the scene is powerful. What most viewers do not register consciously is that the length of the silence that follows Stewie's declaration, the pause before the scene moves on, is slightly longer than any equivalent silence in any other episode of the show up to that point. The writers and editors of that episode made a choice to let the silence be longer than television convention would typically allow. That extended silence is an Easter egg of sorts, a meta-message hidden in the pacing of a single scene. This moment is different, more serious, more true than what usually happens here. Slow down. Feel it. The silence itself is the hidden thing, and the hiding place is time rather than space. There is one more category of hidden detail that deserves its own space here, and it involves what might be called structural Easter eggs moments, where the architecture of an episode is itself the secret. The show has occasionally built episodes in which the structure of the storytelling contains a hidden message that is invisible if you watch the episode normally, but becomes visible if you step back and look at how the episode is organized. The clearest example of this is in the Season 10 episode Stewie Goes for a Drive, a relatively minor episode that nonetheless contains a structural curiosity. The episode is organized around two parallel storylines, Stewie's and Peter's, that seem to be thematically unrelated. Stewie's storyline involves a small act of independence. Peter's involves a social obligation he is trying to avoid. By the end of the episode, both storylines resolve simultaneously, and the resolutions mirror each other in a way that reveals a thematic connection that the episode never stated explicitly. Both storylines are about the difference between what a person wants to do and what they feel compelled to do by the expectations of others. The episode never says this. It simply shows it twice in different contexts and lets the parallel sit there for whoever notices it. Most viewers see two unrelated stories resolved at the same time. The viewer who notices the structural parallel sees a meditation on social obligation that the show embedded in its architecture without naming it. The show's relationship with the Wilhelm scream, that piece of audio that appears across so many episodes, extends in one direction toward a larger point about how Family Guy operates as a piece of media within a specific production culture. The Wilhelm scream is something you only hear as a Wilhelm scream if you have been educated to recognize it, usually by someone in the film enthusiast community who took the time to point it out. Once you know what it is, you hear it everywhere. Before you know what it is just a scream. The Easter eggs in Family Guy work the same way. Most of them are invisible to the person who does not know what to look for. The sheet music on Lois's piano is invisible as an Easter egg unless you can read music. The production code system is invisible as a continuity guide unless you know how to cross-reference it. The Conway Twitty song selection is invisible as a hidden joke unless you know enough Conway Twitty to trace the lyrical connection. All of these things are present for everyone who has ever watched the show. They are accessible to almost no one without the specific knowledge that makes them visible. This is actually what makes Family Guy's approach to Easter eggs philosophically interesting, and why a show this densely layered can also be one of the most comfortable things to watch while you are trying to sleep. The hidden things do not demand to be found. They do not interrupt the story to announce themselves. They wait. They have been waiting for 25 years and more in some cases. The sheet music was there in the first episode, and it is still there. The number 31 is still at the address on Spooner Street. Brian's gun is still in the safety deposit box in the vault where he and Stewie spent that long weekend. The things that are hidden in Family Guy are patient in a way that only written things can be, present and still, and waiting for exactly the right pair of eyes or ears to arrive. And the world is full of people who have found them. The fan communities that grew up around this show on message boards in the early 2000s, on Reddit across the last decade and a half, in comment sections and Discord servers and video essays, and exactly this kind of slow, careful audio journey represents something genuinely touching. They are people who decided that the thing in front of them was worth looking at more carefully than the story required. Who decided that the background of a cartoon was worth pausing for? Who decided that the name on a trophy in a scene that lasted 3 seconds deserved to be read? Who found, in that decision, a community of other people making the same choice? The show rewarded them. Not always. Not in every episode. The later seasons had fewer hidden things worth finding, as the culture of careful construction that defined the early years gave way to the culture of volume and speed that defined the later ones. But the early seasons and the best episodes of the middle and later seasons consistently rewarded the patient viewer with something genuine. A real joke that only you caught. A real connection between episodes that the show never pointed to. A real piece of history or music or literature or film that the writers embedded in a background because they could not help themselves, because they knew too much and loved what they knew and could not stop themselves from hiding it somewhere in what they made. What connects all of these Easter eggs, from the most famous to the most obscure, is an underlying orientation toward the audience, a belief that there are people watching who will look more carefully than the story requires, who will pause and rewind and zoom in and cross-reference and spend their own time in service of noticing something that no one made them notice. Family Guy has always made those people feel welcome, even when the show itself was at its most chaotic, its most abrasive, its most cartoonishly indifferent to consequence. Underneath all of that, underneath the shock and the cutaways and the reset buttons and the decades of gradual character drift, there was always a layer that was doing something else. Something slower and more careful. Something that rewarded exactly the kind of attention that we have been paying here tonight. The show's Easter eggs are not just jokes. They are a record of the people who made it. Their private references, their inside jokes, their affection for their own history, their compulsion to hide things in places that most people would never look. They are the show talking to itself, and to the small portion of its audience that has always been willing to listen to that quieter conversation. And if you are the kind of person who has been listening to this sitting quietly wherever you are in the world right now, in the dark or in the soft light, letting these words drift past like something half-remembered from a dream, then you are exactly the person this show has always been making these for. You are the second audience, the one that leans closer, the one that notices. So the next time you put Family Guy on in the background, in that comfortable half-awake state where the images drift past without demanding full attention, let some small part of your mind stay alert to the edges of the frame, to the backgrounds, to the signs and the newspapers and the books on the shelves, to the faces in the crowds that look just slightly too familiar, to the music playing beneath the words that sounds, if you know how to listen, like something else entirely, to the sheet music on the piano that, if you know how to read it, will tell you exactly what song is being played before anyone opens their mouth to sing. The show put those things there, on purpose, for you. Sleep well. And if this journey through the hidden layers of one of television's most secretive and surprising shows meant something to you, please leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of content, and it takes about a second. And if you want to be here for the next one, wherever it goes, a subscription will make sure of that. Thank you for being the second audience tonight, the one that looks a little closer, the one that hears a little more. Sleep well.